down to talk about his most recent research. And I know there's going to be a lot of questions, and I don't know how much time the students over here from St. Mary's have, but listen up close. This is some pretty deep research, so but it'll be very interesting. We want to welcome you here. Glad your teacher was able to fit you in. My name is Steve Comerford. I want to introduce Satish and just give you a real brief setup for how we got to Satish's work. Satish and Dr. Gupta is going to have to fill in on this here, but this started a long time ago, actually going back to the late 80s in many respects for where we're at today. And I just want to give you a little bit of background information so you can see where this fits in as well. I'd like to thank Satish for coming today and presenting. I think this is your first presentation on this outside of the department or up at the university. In the process of getting some of this stuff published as well. Dr. Gupta has done a lot of work over the last 15 to 20 years on this topic, and some of these points I'm going to make here briefly. And a lot of this was funded by some of your soybean and corn checkoffs. This most recent stuff was partially funded by the soybean checkoff. We want to thank the producer groups for doing that. But what is this all about? How did we get to this recent point of Dr. Gupta's most recent research? It goes back a ways. And there's basically three types of water quality issues that relate to agriculture that exist in Minnesota. There's a lot of others that indirectly agriculture gets pulled in on it, but phosphorus, sediments, and nitrogen are those that somehow agriculture gets tied into one way or the other. And the Minnesota River was sort of the center point for all this, going back to about 20, or actually about 30 years ago now. These get tied in, and I want to point this out because I think this is very important, especially for students. There's a lot of policies that get set up related to water quality. Policies are not science, okay? They're public policies that get put into place. Theoretically, we should think that science drives the policy. In many cases, it's the exact opposite. But one of those that would drive to this point where Dr. Gupta is talking about today is this Gulf hypoxia nutrient reduction strategy that goes back to the 1990s when this issue was created, and in the mid-2000s, it started in the early 2000s, and they established a nutrient reduction strategy, a 40 to 50% reduction of phosphorus and nitrogen to the Gulf of Mexico. I happen to be on for about 5 years representing the soybean growers on a Upper Mississippi River Basin Gulf Hypoxia Nutrient Reduction Committee, and found out a lot about this, what was on. But building off of this nutrient reduction strategy for the Gulf was a Minnesota nutrient reduction strategy. Now these are policy positions that got put into place, okay? Effectively, they weren't legislation, they were established by existing, whoever happened to be in these regulatory organizations. The MPCA is the one that put together the nutrient reduction strategy for Minnesota. Both of these focus on about a 40 to 45% reduction in nitrogen and phosphorus from leaving the state. For Minnesota's, it's getting into the Gulf from the standpoint of the federal level. Okay, keep in mind, policies are not science. We want to get to the science here today. The history of Dr. Gupta's research goes back to the 90s. There were some studies, I say that in quotes, that means people looked at information and put together a policy paper where they effectively blamed the agriculture for phosphorus and sediment in the river because it was creating issues. It didn't meet the Minnesota River didn't meet the water quality standards. Said it was coming from fields. There was some work done by now this is jumping through some stages, Dr. Gupta, with some LiDAR studies that established that, oh, no, it wasn't coming from fields. It was primarily coming from stream banks and bluffs, okay? Not from soil erosion. So that, because of these studies in the 90s, there was a tremendous amount of dollars that went into implementing projects to reduce the issue of sediment and phosphorus in the rivers. The Minnesota River actually has, depending on how you calculate the numbers, over the last 30 years, it's been between 2 and 3 billion, with a B, dollars that have focused on this issues of sediment and phosphorus, okay? That's pretty astonishing when you think of it, and if we didn't have the right focus, it can be monies that aren't going to accomplish anything. The next step was Dr. Gupta did some work on phosphorus, looking at the role of sediments associated with the soluble phosphorus, which is what really causes the water quality issues, in binding up the phosphorus as it floats down the river. Because when it's not coming from the stream banks, the focus then was, well, it must be the increased flows that are coming off and causing that stream and bluff erosion. Dr. Gupta did some work on establishing that, which goes to the next step. They started blaming tile drainage as, oh, increasing flows. Dr. Gupta did some work on evaluating whether tile drainage was a factor, and effectively found that no, it was precipitation, which leads into, I guess, the present work that Dr. Gupta is dealing with is what are the drivers of this, because tile drainage was, and nitrogen fertilizer usage are the two focuses of nutrient reduction as far as nitrogen goes on these policy strategies that are in place. What are the drivers of nitrogen loading in the rivers? And ultimately their assumption of relationships to a hypoxia. Now I say that as a relationship versus cause and effect. We can have some discussion on that. So I wanted you to keep this in mind as Dr. Gupta presents, and I'll turn this over to Dr. Gupta, and if you want to further introduce. Dr. Gupta is recently announced he's going to be retiring after a fabulous career in his role at the university. He's been there since the early 70s, I believe, and I'll say it, he's world renowned in his field of study. He's publications are all over the place, and keep in mind that sometimes you might hear criticism of Dr. Gupta's work within the state of Minnesota, but when you get outside the boundaries of Minnesota, his work is looked at very highly in his field and in multiple fields associated with this. So with that, Dr. Gupta, I would like you to take over and present your work. So you need this one? Or? Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, can you hear me? So you've got yours got to flip on.
Okay, there we go. Well, thank you very much, Steve. I really appreciate your tremendous introduction. As Steve said, I got my PhD. I need some help. I got my PhD in '72, and that was from Utah State University in Logan, Utah. Beautiful place. I came over here to visit some friends, and I met a gentleman named Bill Larson. He was with the USDA Agriculture Research Service, and he had some grant money, and so I started working with him, and I worked for the in that position for 5 years, and then for 7 or 8 years I worked for the U.S. government, USDA in Agriculture Research Service, and then I was moved to the university in the faculty position, and I've been teaching there since '85. So overall, it's going to be about 46 years of my teaching and research since I got my PhD. That I've been in the same building, but the different money is coming from different sources, initially from the US government and then from the University of Minnesota. I've done some work at Lamberton when the Minnesota River issue came up, and this goes back to 1996. And as Steve mentioned, the sediment issue and then the phosphorus issue that we have. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk about my recent work, not my work actually, it's my students' work, Nathaniel Palmer's work, and then at the end, if you guys have any questions about this work or some other work that we have done on the sediment or phosphorus, then I'll be glad to talk about that. This work was done as part of the master thesis by Nathaniel Palmer. Great student, he was in my class, and I got some money and I thought, hey, we need to get going on this thing, and so he just finished his and looking for a job, and this is more looking at the climate and land cover change impacts on the river envelopes. Before I go into the presentation, I want you guys to just have this thing in the mind. This is the time period from January to January, and this is how much water is available in the soil to the plants. And this is more like a recharge of the soil. This work was done by Dr. Don Baker. He was a climatologist. He worked closely with Wally Nelson. If you know, he passed away some time ago. And basically what it says is that January time our soils are frozen over here. Then someplace around here, March or so, starts thawing out, and we have some rains and the water goes into the soil. And then we plant over here corn or soybean or any other crop, and they start sucking the water out. And around middle of September, we have depleted quite a bit of the water from the soils. And so there's a lot of storage capacity in the soil. And then at this time, around middle of September on, we start getting some more rains and it starts filling it up, and then we go back to this cycle. So soil has a lot of capacity to hold that water, and that's a very important physical attribute of the soil, and keep that thing in mind. The other thing that I want to caution you is that I'm using most of the stuff in millimeters. And I know it's a pain in the neck to convert it, but keep in mind about 200 millimeters is same as 8 inches. And for this soil, this work was done at Lamberton, and for this soil, field capacity water content can hold, the soil can hold about 21 inches of water. And that's, if you are building point where the plants cannot take up any water, then soil still has about 11 inches of water. And the total available water that we have is in the soil about 10 inches of water. So that's a background you just want to keep in mind. As Steve said, this work by Nathaniel was done in the context that we have hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And many of you probably heard in the newspaper or the radio that this zone has been kind of increasing over time. And also it's in the literature, at least in the scientific literature, it's very well established. There's a whole series of reasons, but among the main reason is that we have nutrients that are coming to the Gulf, and also the fresh water, because the ocean has a salt water, so there's some layering that happens, and mixing is a problem. So unless you got a hurricane that mixes up, then it's okay, but if there's no mixing, then you have these microbes that are working on it and depleting the oxygen level. But most of the nutrient, although the Mississippi River watershed is fairly large, most of the nutrients and the fresh water that's coming is from the Midwest. And among the, of course, there's some phosphorus coming close to the Gulf of Mexico. That's one nutrient, but the other part is the nitrogen that's coming, and most of the nitrogen is coming from the agriculture land. So our interest was, this is how the area looks like. This is in square kilometers as a function of time. And you can see the last year, 2017, is kind of the maximum area that they had, which was hypoxic, which has less than 2 milligrams per liter of oxygen content. And so the last 5 years, the value, its extent is about 15,000 kilometers square. And the Gulf of Mexico task force that Steve mentioned, they're trying to get it to about 5,000 level. And I think our interest was, why is it fluctuating something like this? Farmers don't go 1 year and start putting the tile line and next year take it out. They don't go and put 100,000 tons of nitrogen in the watershed in 1 year and next year 200,000 and then go back to 5,000. So it's not like that. So there must be some other reason for this fluctuation. So if you look at 1988, and if you're an old timer like I am, 1988 was a very dry year. 89 was a very dry year. So we didn't have any hypoxic zone. There was not much nitrogen going and not much water going into the Gulf of Mexico. And then 1993 is fairly large. It was a wet year. So we thought there might be some relationship to the precept trends that we're getting. So in my presentation, we're looking at what are the reasons for these fluctuations. Not so much to predict this thing, but what are the reasons for these fluctuations. I think most of you probably heard in the last, over the Thanksgiving, that there was a national climate assessment, and this was in 2014, the one that came, that's number 4, I think this was number 1 or number 2, and this is telling us between these two periods, 1991 to 2011, versus 1901 and 1960, how much increase in precept we have got. So if you look at these darker green colors, we are getting about 15% more precept now than the period 1901 to 1960. On average, we get around the cities, we get 30-35 inches of rainfall. So if you take 15%, you're getting about 4-5 inches more rainfall now. If we look at the data that our climate group has, and this is going back every 30 years from 1920 to 50, 51 to 80, and 81 to 2010. You can see this red area that we have less than 550 millimeters, whereas the dark blue is about 775. And over time, this dark blue is creeping into the state that then more and more, we're getting more and more rainfall now than we used to get. Now, if you look at a specific area, this is the Blue Earth River watershed, and average every year we're getting about 692, and now we are getting 870, and that's about 100 millimeter more, that's about 4 inches more. If you heard, I think 2016, they had quite a bit of rain in Waseca area and St. Clair, and they got a lot of washouts. Okay, that was 8-9 inches, it came in 2-3 days. So we are not only getting more rain, but it's also coming with a high intensity, and there are a lot more heavier storms. So we know that precept is changing, and we are getting a lot more precept. Now the other question that has been raised, and it's always, whenever you have discussion about the Minnesota River, everybody brings up emotions and says, we used to have prairies and we used to have a lot of buffaloes and all that stuff, which is good. But you know, you got to look at it. What did the prairies do? So that was another question that we had to address, because the people in Iowa, they are saying, well, we grow the soybeans now, used to be prairies, and so there's more water flowing into the river because of soybeans. So we want to look at that issue too. So here is the area in the cropping system as a function of time, and this is for the Minnesota River Basin at Jordan. So all the area upstream of that. So of course, 1940 or so, that's when the soybeans start catching up. That's we started planting over here. And then in the last, say 30, 40 years, it's kind of relatively constant. There's also a corn, number of acres or percent area is increasing. Before, in the 1940s and 1920s, most of what we grew is small grains, wheat. And out of that small grain, most of this was little, oats over here. And there was a little bit of hay, so all the soybean area that's coming, that is coming from the small grain area, mostly oats and also some hay, and there were also some prairies that are being plowed and planted probably in corn and soybean. I don't have any record of telling you how much area was gone from prairies into soybean and so on. Our records that we have, nitrogen records, they go back to 1979, and I'm going to cover this part of the analysis because nitrogen records are not available. I have done the water flow records going back to about 1940. And so it doesn't show us soybean is causing that big of a problem. But let's keep in mind this part of the objective we are looking at. So we had two objectives. One was to assess the relative importance of changes in precip, land cover, that means we have changed the land cover from wheat and oats to soybeans, and how much nitrogen inorganic fertilizer we are applying on annual and monthly stream flow, base flow that carries the nitrate, and nitrogen N loads in the Midwestern rivers. So that was the main objective. And basically we are using the data that has been collected by USGS and others and try to analyze and see if we can decipher what's causing it, and then hoping that once we decipher it, we can figure out the factor that we can manipulate to minimize our N losses from the agricultural landscape to our rivers. So the watershed that are the rivers that we consider, there are 7 rivers because most people don't have the nitrogen data that you can include a lot more number of rivers. So these are the 7 rivers. This is the Minnesota River, and the measurements were made at Jordan. And then we have the Cottonwood River that is in our backyard here, the Blue Earth River. These are the 3 rivers in Minnesota. The Grand River in Missouri is bordering Iowa and Missouri over here. The Illinois River, this is a fairly large watershed. And then the Embarrass River is this little red over here. That's a small watershed in Illinois. And the Maumee River, which is right here, that's flowing into Lake Erie. And that's where all the nitrogen data that we could gather. That is mostly collected by the USGS. But let's talk about the Minnesota River first, and then we'll go on to the other watershed. So this is where the gauge is at Jordan that USG has been monitoring the water flow as well as the nitrogen loads. For this, this is the nitrogen load in the Minnesota River at Jordan. And this is the flow weighted concentration. This is the base flow, that's the water that goes through the soil and in tile drain as well as through the groundwater into the river. And this is the stream flow that they monitor. This is the soybean area, and again we are covering only this period because that's where the data is available. The soybean area, you can see that it's going up and then kind of going down, but then every year you don't have large fluctuation that can explain the changes in the hypoxic zone. But on the other hand, if you look at the yearly annual precip, there are some fluctuations. And that's what we were interested in seeing, if this fluctuation in the precip can explain how much the nitrogen is coming, which is right here in that river. But before I go into all the data, let's look at a snippet of data and see what it says. Here's in 1980, this is the year, that's the precip we got in that year, how much is the stream flow, the base flow, and that's the flow weighted concentration, and that's the nitrogen load. This MT stands for metric ton, which is 1,000 kilograms. 1988, as I said, was very dry year. We had only about 480 millimeter of precip, so that means there was not much water going into the stream, as well as there was not much tile drainage as well going into the groundwater. And flow weighted concentration is 4.7, but the loads were low too. 1989 was dry year too. It's a little bit more than the previous year, but because the soil was so dry, that first slide I showed you, that some of the water stayed in the soil, so there was not much stream flow, not much base flow, and even the N loads were lower, okay? And again, the crops were not doing very well, so whatever the fertilizer was added in those 2 years, but sitting in the soil, it didn't go anyplace. 1990 was a little bit better. It says average precip. Now these are the average values for the whole period 79 to 2014. So that's pretty close to average value. So stream flow was a little bit higher. It should have been close to about 150 millimeter, and the reason is because some of this water stayed in the soil because previous 2 years it was very, very dry. So when you go to the load, there was some increase in the nitrogen coming. Some of that is what was applied in this year, and as well as some of the nitrogen was in the previous 2 years. Then go to 92, we had a lot more rain, and then the stream flow started going up, and the loads are very, very high. And go to 92, it's a little bit less, but still the loads are fairly high, and 93 we had a lot of rain and a lot of loads coming. So you can see this nitrogen is sitting over there in the soil, as well as if you have a capacity to hold that water, the nitrogen is not going to come out into the river. So this is what we were trying to look at it. We said, can we explain the variation in the stream flow, the base flow, the flow weighted concentration and the nitrogen load by the variation in the precip, the soybean area and the fertilizer rates. So it's a more like a statistical tool. It's called a stepwise backward regression. And basically what we're doing is we have to convert the stream flow, base flow into a log values. And we have log of predicted variables, and we say, is it related to the precip in this year? Or is it related to the precip in last year? Or is it related to the precip 2 years before and the soybean area? So in this regression, I did not add the N fertilizer, and I'll explain that to you why I didn't include in this regression analysis. So when we run the regression analysis, we are looking at, is this variable significantly describing the variation in the predicted variable? So we are looking at each of those variables. And that is described by the p-value. And if the p-value is greater than 0.05, then it's not significant. The smaller the value of the p, that is more significant it is. So if soy is more than 0.05, then we drop this variable and we run the regression again. And if P3 is not significant, we drop that and run this again. So that's the procedure for the statistical analysis. So what we found for this period, 79 to 2014, the predicted variable which we are trying to describe as the annual stream flow can be described by the precip in the current year, the precip in the last year, and these two variables not significantly contributing. And we can explain about 71% of the variation in the stream flow. Similarly, annual base flow, we can have the P1 and P2 are significant variable explaining the variation in base flow and then of course the P2, but this is very close to 0.05, so this power is not that strong. As the further you get away from that given year, the power of the previous precept is not that strong. So it's explaining 79% of the variation. Annual flow weighted concentration we could not predict it very well. So annual load, we were able to predict by P1 and P2 and explain 68% of the variation. So now let's look at the data, the whole period data. In here I have plotted the stream flow versus the calendar year precept. So this is the P1 value here, this is the base flow and a P1 value over here, the nitrogen load and a P1 and the flow weighted concentration. I think after doing this stuff, we should get away from the idea of using the concentration. Concentration could be high, but the water flow is very small, who cares? I think our idea should be looking at the load, N loads. We want to reduce those N loads to the rivers. That's where we should be concentrating. So now, in this data, if you look over here, you'll see these little blue dots. And they are the lowest value for any given precip level. You have the lowest stream flow. You have the lowest base flow and you have the lowest N loads. And our idea is, why can't we achieve this? What are the management practices people are doing that these years happen to be the low flows, base flow, stream flow, and N loads? But we looked at this data, the reason these years are the lowest because the previous year was a dry year. So all the water that came in these years, some of that water stayed in the soil and did not go to the stream flow. So it has nothing to do with the management practices, it's just the previous year was dry year, so that's the reason that these things are low. And the reason is again that first slide which I showed you, there's a storage capacity. So we also have a little red dot over here, and idea was what happened here. This was 2011. And the previous year was very wet year. And the reason was that you have a lot of rain. In 2010, 933 millimeter, that water stayed in the soil, and when the next year, 2010-11 came, it was only 637, then there was too much water and it started flowing out, and the nitrogen came out. And the same thing happens on this N load and the base flow. So here is the 2010 and 2011. So this is the 2010, that's the 2011. And look at this, this happened in the month of September, we had about 8 inches of rainfall. So because of this rain, we had a little bit increase in the stream flow, a little bit increase in the base flow, and then of course October, November, December, they're kind of average values. But when you go in the month of March and April, that water is sitting in the soil, and even if you don't have much water coming in the precip, it's shooting up the stream flow and the base flow. The total precip in this year was 933, whereas this is average. So in this year, if there was no water sitting over there, this should have been a less flow, both in the streams as well as in the base flow. If you look at the end loads, the same thing happens. Nitrogen, there was a little bit of nitrogen loss in September because of this precip, 8 inches of that, and that's the residual nitrogen that's sitting in the soil. But right after that, even with the average precip value, this should, because some of that soil nitrogen came from the last year, and some of that might have been applied in the fall or early spring. So it's more controlled by the precip than any other variable in nitrogen getting out of the landscape. So no, I did not include the nitrogen inorganic fertilizer, and the reason is this database only goes from 87 to 2012, whereas Minnesota River was 79 to 2014. So what we did was we ran the regression again for this period. Now these are the nitrogen fertilizer that has been sold in each of the counties, and then we average it based on the watershed. So again, if you look at the nitrogen fertilizer variation that was sold, there is not much variation. This goes down a little bit, comes up, and average value is 5.5 megagram per kilometers. If you multiply this by 10, that's how many kilograms per hectare we're applying. Now this value is much lower than what we recommend on a corn, which is 150, 175, and this is 55. And the reason is we don't have all the area under corn. We have some on soybeans, and everybody doesn't apply on the soybean, and we also have some area which we are not cultivating. So these numbers are just about right. And again, Blue Earth has 7.1 or 71 kilogram per hectare. Cottonwood is about 60. Now this is the Grand River in Missouri, that's very low, okay? And we're going to compare the Minnesota River and the Grand River in a minute. The Embarrass River, this is in Illinois, that's about 80. Illinois River, that's a big watershed, the 67, and the Maumee River is 57 kilogram per hectare. And the reason why we have Grand River is very low is because it's a hilly watershed, and most of the soil is under not row crop, but more hay and that kind of thing. So when you have a hay, that means there are a lot more animals over there too, and then you are also applying a lot more manure. Now, we did not have the database every year how much manure was applied. It was only every 5 years. Again, this is the USGS database. So this 4.4 is the inorganic fertilizer, and 1.3 is the nitrogen that we have from the manure. This is in the Minnesota River at Jordan, the whole watershed. And this is the Grand River in Missouri. There is less inorganic fertilizer applied, but a lot more nitrogen is applied in the manure. But keep in mind, the manure, this is the available nitrogen in a given year. But once you apply manure, the second year, we also have 10 to 15% nitrogen available. And even on the third year, we have some nitrogen available. So if you add those, then these two values are not very different. Both these watersheds, we're applying about the same amount or similar amount of nitrogen on a hectare basis. So this we ran again the regression. This is the N load, and we're saying is it related to precip in the current year, a previous year, or 2 years before, or the soybean area, or how much fertilizer was applied in that watershed. And we found we could not explain the variation in the N load because of the nitrogen application. And you saw that nitrogen application is almost kind of relatively constant. There are not very many fluctuations from year to year. So you can see this, if you look at this data over here, which is the nitrogen application, and you look at the variation over here in the hypoxic zone, you can make a sense, well, this variation or any of these variations are not explaining this variation in the hypoxic zone. So that kind of makes sense. So we also still go back to its a precip value. So the watershed, again, what are the characteristics of this watershed? The Minnesota, the Cottonwood, the Blue Earth, the Illinois, the Embarrass, the Maumee River, they're all relatively flat watershed. Our slope, 0 to 2%, 67 to 98% of the area is relatively flat. Corn and soybean are the major crops, from 67 to 87% of the area is under corn and soybean. But if you look at the Grand River, it's a relatively steep watershed. Only 21% of the area is relatively flat, but 2 to 12% is 67% of the area, and only about 21% of the corn soybeans are grown over there. But again, keep that thing in mind, when you have a steep watershed, when the rain comes, most of the water does not go through the soil. And nitrogen only goes to the river, it's not in the surface runoff. It's not in the water that flows at the soil surface, it's the water that's going through the soil, into the tile, or into the groundwater. So if there is a way you can prevent the water to go into the soil, we used to have surface inlets. That's what surface inlets did. Take the water away from the soil and don't let the water go through the soil. So that's the reason we have less nitrogen coming in the Grand River. So now here are all the watersheds that we have, 7 of them. This is the Streamflow versus the precip in the current year. That's a Baseflow versus precip, and this is the end yields. End loads could be different in different watersheds, but you put it on a unit area basis, how many megagrams per kilometer square. Again, you multiply this by 10, that's going to tell you it's 20 kilogram per hectare loss at certain precip value. So again, if you look at these stream flows, they are almost all the watershed have a similar relationship. So you can represent this by a 1, and what it means is that a given value of precip in this year and the last year, the stream flow is about the same, it doesn't matter which watershed you are. So if that is the case, then you know that the rest of the precip, if you take the stream flow out of the precip, rest of that precip that's coming, that's going into the atmosphere as evapotranspiration. And this curve says the evapotranspiration from these watersheds that we consider is relatively same at any given precip level in the current year and the past year. Whereas base flow is different, that depends upon the soil properties, how much goes through the soil, into the tile line and so on. And again, this green line is the Missouri. This is the Grand River in Missouri, and that's the lowest value. Same is the base flow is low, and same is the end load is low. So then the question comes into is that, look, stream flows are about same. What's causing this watershed to have low end loads, whereas Minnesota and other watersheds are higher up? And the reason, again, as I said, this is the base flow as a fraction of the stream flow. How much water is going through the soil, how much water is going in the overland flow, and Grand River in Missouri is the lowest. And the reason it's lowest is because it's a steep watershed, and so most of the water is running off. There's less quantity of water going through the soil. Now keep in mind, if the water goes in surface runoff, then you're going to have a lot more sediment transport, soil erosion, and there's going to be a lot more phosphorus transport. And that's the problem in the Grand River in Missouri. They have a lot more sediment going in the rivers and the phosphorus. But they have very low nitrogen going because there's less water going through the soil. So I'm just going to compare the Minnesota River at Jordan, and this is the Grand River at Missouri. So the idea is, this is the precip value. We like to have more, even at higher precip value, less nitrogen going into the rivers over here. And in Minnesota, it's much higher. And this is, if we start saying, okay, let's cut down the nitrogen application, this curve is going to come down, okay? But it's not going to have, we want to bring this curve down to this green level. And the only way you can do is that's caused by the precip, and that's a water management problem. It's not a nitrogen management problem. And showed you that in a minute, that you can keep on doing any kind of nitrogen management, and the effect would be marginal as if our climate keeps on changing and we keep on getting more nitrogen. So even at 900 millimeter of precip, you see we are getting about 15 kilogram per hectare of nitrogen loss in the Minnesota River Basin, whereas we are getting at about 1 or 2. Okay? So that's a problem. It's not a nitrogen problem. I know there have been a lot more emphasis put on there. Apply in the fall, apply in the spring, and I'll show you the data. That's going to have a very small impact on the nitrogen loads. So here are some strategies. So we can have management strategies, and fall to spring, we can use a nitrification inhibitor, or we can side dress the nitrogen, or have some cover crop, and I'll show you the data. All of these are going to have marginal impact on this thing. So what we have to do is, what the water is coming from the tile line, we got to remediate. That's the only way it's going to work. And then again, the strategies are, we can have saturated buffers or bioreactors. The difficulty with these two is, we got water coming very fast out of the tile line, and you need 8 to 24 hours for those water to sit in the bioreactor, the microbes to work on it before it can convert the nitrate into nitrogen gas. So ultimately what I think we need to do is have some kind of wetland way of treating our tile water. So I'm going to show you this. Many of you, if you have a tile line on your property over there, you'll know how fast the water is coming. It just is coming. This is 40, 50 acre of land, and this tile line, and we had a student who we were interested in capturing that nitrate from that water. So we were trying to build a water softener in the field where we had a resin, and we were trying to pass this water, and here is Carrie Wolf. It was master degree for her, and Nathaniel is taking the picture. So we had a column over there at the end, and we can capture all the nitrate. The problem is the column we are using, it gets nitrate or captured within an hour, then you're going to go back and change another column. And that's a very cumbersome and time-consuming process. So it's not viable. But it was very good to understand what are the limitations of using that. So now, time is a big problem. You've got to have this water sit in the bioreactor or saturated buffers for a long time, 8 to 24 hours, before you can convert the nitrate into nitrogen gas. So when I said we talk about fall to spring and so on, here is some data from Illinois. This is my treatments over here. This is how much water came in the tile line. This is the nitrogen loss from that tile line, and these are 3 different years. And this is the flow weighted nitrogen loss. That means every centimeter of water that came from the land, how many kilograms per hectare we lost. So here is a precept. These are 3 years. 2002 they had 1280 millimeter, 820, 770, and so on. They had control treatment, but they didn't apply in nitrogen. They applied 78 kilogram per hectare in the fall, 156 kilogram per hectare in the fall, 234, and then they applied the same amount in the spring, 156, 234, and 156 is their optimal value, and they also mix it with a nitrogen inhibitor, and then also 156 in side dress. Look at the flow. Because we had a lot more rain, the drainage was very high. In here, the drainage is relatively less. Because the drainage was very high, we also have a lot more nitrogen going out. Okay? And again, the nitrogen was less, but if you convert it on every centimeter per unit area, then these values are relatively small, between 0.6 to 0.1.7 or so. So what it's saying is that in the year you have a lot more drainage, you're going to have a lot more loss. It's nothing to do with how much fertilizer you apply. There were some significant differences between these two, but between fall and spring didn't make any difference. These losses are about same. Okay? That's the reason I'm saying, and I have other data too. There's a data from Iowa. Dan James had done this. Again, he applied 196 in the fall. He had a 168 in pre-plant and side dress. Again, you look at the drainage. It's a year when you have a lot more precip. That's where most of the water is coming out. And nitrogen loss is very high. But if you do it on every centimeter of the water comes out, then these values are approximately same. So if these values are approximately same, that means more water coming out. Because of more precip, you're going to have a lot more loss. And I don't think I'm giving you guys any new information. If you're on the land, you know about these things. So what we need to do is we need to think about the wetland strategies. If you go back in the history, 1864 was a very dry year. And the steamboats could not come from St. Louis to St. Paul. there was not enough water that they can have a continuous 3-4 feet deep water in the Mississippi River. So the people petitioned to the Congress, and this had a Army Corps of Engineers. We are going to have 4-inch deep water, 4-foot deep water in the Mississippi River at the minimum. So what they did was, our water used to go in the Mississippi River every place. It was shallow water, there are a lot of floodplains over there. The channel was not that deep. So they could build the levees over here, and they concentrated all the water that's going in the floodplain into that channel, try to make the channel relatively narrow. So when you have a lot more water going in a narrow channel, it would scour the bottom on its own, and that's how they achieved the 4-foot deep channel. And then there was a competition with the railroad. They wanted a 6-foot deep channel, and then later on they wanted a 9-foot deep channel. So right now they're doing the dredging of the Mississippi River every so place along the river, try to make sure there's a 9-foot channel. Now, right now, considering, and the way they did was, so here is a picture by Henry Bassi. These are late 1800 pictures of the Mississippi River. And this is a closing dam. So this is the area, this is not connected to the channel. So they said we're going to close this part so water never gets into the other additional area like floodplains. And they also put these wing dams. Wing dams are willow branches tied together, and they drop a layer of it, put some rocks on the top, put another layer, and they just build these wing dams. Eventually the area in here gets filled up with the soil or the sediment, and then you have a narrow channel. So this is how the channel looks like. These are all the wing dams. So we are cutting down the floodplain interaction. So if you want 8 to 24 hours of water sitting at some place and interacting with the sediment so that the nitrogen can be converted and nitrate can be converted into nitrogen gas, this is the area we should be looking at it. We try to see, no, we get a lot more water, there's plenty of water for navigation. Can't we open up some of this control dams that we have put over there, not the wing dam, but the control dam that we're controlling the water spreading any place. I think that would be the way to do some of the remediation. So our conclusion for this section of the presentation is climate change is the main driver of increased stream flow, base flow, and end loads in recent years. Management strategies, we talk about fall and spring. As long as you're optimal end rate, I think you are going to have very marginal impact of changing fall to spring and so on. Wetland is probably the best remediation strategy for reducing end load to the Gulf of Mexico. And I think we should start looking at the possibility of using floodplain to remediate our water, as long as it doesn't affect the people and the property. I know that in the floodplains they have built up some houses and so on. So that's the first part of it, okay? The second part is that we have been talking about these prairies, and the prairies were there and they transpire a lot of water. So before we did this experiment in our previous publication, I had gone back in the literature and tried to see how much water is transpired by different crops. So here is a corn and soybean. It gives out anywhere around between 600 to 650 millimeter of water into the atmosphere. But the crops we used to have, small grain, gives only 300 to 350. Wild hay and the alfalfa was 240 to 580. Perennial grasses, this is the value from North Dakota, South Dakota. Maybe they don't have enough water, that's why it's low. And again, you guys probably heard about the Kranza wheat that they are thinking about. That's about 300 or 350 millimeter. Potholes in the North Dakota can be, shallow potholes would dry out, but if they're deeper, they can give out 796. Minnesota lakes give between 550 and 600 and so on. So this was interesting to us because we had not answered that question by some measurements. So we work with Yabe Glasscard with the MDA, and he has expertise in this thing. And basically what we're doing is we are using the satellite images try to analyze how much of the evapotranspiration is occurring from different vegetation. And it's using the model called MATIC. It's a mapping evapotranspiration at high resolution using internalized calibration. And basically what you're doing is we have satellites, Landsat 7 and 8, they're taking images every 2 weeks, and we take those images and take the properties of the vegetation out of those images and use those to calculate how is the vegetation, what fraction of the evapotranspiration might be occurring at different times of the year. So this is the a prairie area near Appleton, and basically we're looking at each pixel, and there are many millions of pixels. So this pixel is a 30 by 30 resolution, and we are calculating the evapotranspiration from a vegetation by knowing the weather properties and see what's the maximum evapotranspiration would occur from any vegetation and what fraction of the contribution is from different vegetation. This is calculated based on the satellite images, this is based on the wind speed, the temperature and so on, the weather condition in that area. So we did this again, this is the Appleton area. We took some weather data from Appleton, Morris and Minnesota. These are our prairie units. These are our irrigated corn units over here, and then green ones are our non-irrigated corn, and the red one, the pink one are non-irrigated, and the green ones are the soybean fields over there. This is the Chippewa Prairie that we have at Appleton over there, and one of the things that they have is they have different units, and they have been burned at different times. So the unit number 1 was burned in 2010 and grazed over there, and then left it like it is, it's just growing. And then we worked in the 2015, and it was burned at that time, and then grazed at the same time. So you'll see some differences between the 2015 compared to 2010, 12, 13, and 14. So it's that Chippewa Prairie Reserve. It's managed by the Nature Conservancy. And again, we just took the satellite images from those, and this is what the burn will look like. So when you have a burn, it takes some time for the vegetation to come out, and so the evapotranspiration from the burn area is going to be a little bit less. So this is that ETRF value that's coming from the satellite images, and it's telling us that this green line, that broken line that you see, that is our recently burned prairie unit, whereas this broken line is the previously burned 4 units. Whereas this little broken line that you see is a non-irrigated soybean, and then irrigated and non-irrigated corn is about the same. So again, evapotranspiration is much higher early in the season from the prairie lands compared to corn and soybean, and whereas in the summertime prairie is kind of shut down and there's not that much evaporation compared to corn and soybean. So here are these months from May to October, that's when we took the images, and the sum of June, and it goes from 8th of June to 22nd of September, we were losing 537 millimeter from previously burned, 406 from the recently burned. Corn was 647 for irrigated, 662 for non-irrigated, and 553 for non-irrigated soybean. There was a couple of wetlands over there, they were transpiring quite a water. Now if you look at the seasonal, which is going from May 1st to October 22nd, then we didn't have the data for the corn because corn and soybeans are not planted that early. And so in here, these values are a little bit higher. But comparatively, if you look at these values are not very different than corn and soybean. And this is very similar to work that Garcia and Jeff Stark did here at Lamberton over 3 years. They use a different technique, and they're saying alfalfa is 650, prairie is about 604, corn is 535, soybean 484, and if you have old alfalfa 340. So keep in mind the previous crop that soybean replaced, they were small grain, oats and wheat and so on. So evapotranspiration from those crops is relatively less. So if you have prairies, this 604, but some area under oats, average is going to be about 450 to 550, which is not any different than corn and soybean. So our conclusion is that most of the ET that we're getting from the recently burned prairie was a little bit less than previously burned. There are small differences in ET values among the various vegetation types. Now if you consider the soybean replaced small grain, mostly oats, and some prairie land, these ET values would suggest that landscape ET has not changed very much. and most of the water that's going in the river because we are getting more precip. So this is my final couple of slides. This research was funded by the Minnesota Soybean Council, the first part, not the second. Second was not funded. Second was funded mostly by the endowed professorship that I hold, and some of the money came from there. Now this is that water softener technique I was trying to use with Carrie Wolf's thesis. Again, the water comes out very fast and it does capture the nitrogen. The problem is you have to go and change it every so often, and that's a laborious process. With that, I'm done with my presentation, and if we have time, Steve, we are open for questions.
Yeah, we should have as many questions as somebody asked. Anybody right off the bat here?
Any of the students have any questions?
Our bus is out there waiting, so I'm sorry we have to go.
Or is it already 10 o'clock?
I thought we would have some of the students run through some of the formulas and.
As long as the students have to and not the students.
Oh, that's okay. Listen, if you have to go, I just want to say, keep on the work, but keep in mind, I mean, it's great. I mean, I like to see the energy in you guys. You guys are our future, okay? And you guys are to keep our environment healthy. One of the things that I want to send a message to you guys, and I've sent it to my kids who are older than you. You know, we are benefiting from buying things from India, China, Vietnam, and so on. But we are not paying for the environmental cost over there. China's air was bad, India's air is getting bad. I bought this sweater, probably $50, $60. In India, you can get it for $1 or $2. And the dyes and everything else, it goes over there. So we are not manufacturing over here, but we are benefiting from that environment. But most of us, we buy that stuff, but this environment over there is going bad that we don't see, and there's an environmental benefit for us. So as we go in future, keep up the good work. We want to have a good environment over here, but think about a little bigger than Minnesota or US. I think coming with my background, I can tell you stories about how I was raised. How many of you guys heard about lamb's quarter? Anybody? One? And farmers would know it. Anybody knows lamb quarter? It's not a quarter of a lamb. It's a weed. And that was my food. Okay? In the sour milk and the rice. And you guys ask yourself how the rest of the world lives. So there are going to be anything we do on this planet, we're going to have environmental impact. We just got to manage it and try to live with the best we can do. And know what happened between China and US. They are going to grow soybean in Brazil. And ask yourself, they're cutting the Amazon jungle to grow soybean. Is that a good thing? And don't we live on the same planet? So I think, keep in mind, I think we need to have energy from you. You guys are the pure of the pure. I used to be like you guys too. We want to change the world. And you guys are going to make a difference. But keep in mind, we don't live in our house. We live in a bigger environment, and we are all connected together, and that has some impact. So anything that you do, think about it. Are we paying the environmental cost of what we buy from other places that we don't see? Is it going to be in the next 20 years, we're going to say, like you see on the TV, for $19 a month, we can save a tree over there or something? So we should not be let them cut the Amazon jungle now. Anyway, I don't want to give you a sermon over there, but thank you for coming. I appreciate it. If you have any comments, send me an email or something. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. We'll let them head out, and then we'll see if anybody else has some questions for Satish. So, excellent program to put on here with two different conclusions. And obviously, looks like everything that we do makes a difference, but like you said, we have to do the best we can with what we have, right? So, oh, we got some questions in here. I see one. I'll get one in the back here first, and then we'll come up here for Greg. You can state your name too if you got a question in here.
Hi, John Lippy from Cortland, and actually a county commissioner over there, and Steve is quite familiar with the problem in my area with high water, and there's a lot of reestablished prairie grasses. Is that a proper way to say it, Steve?
mean matted or grasses?
Well, that's what I'm gonna work up to, because his things were about burned and previously burned.
And
So
also,
I'd like to see you guys just discuss that a little bit.
well, I was gonna ask that very question, John, and that is, on your slides there with the prairie, you indicated you were burned, and then they were grazed.
Like, in that year.
Yeah, to simulate that, where a lot of people relate the existing, what we call conservation acreage, that the stuff grows up, it doesn't get grazed, it doesn't get hayed, it doesn't, baled or and removed, so there's no management on it. The difference in water usage between something that is managed by grazing or haying, taking off it versus where it just sits there and say map's over.
Okay. Well, we did only 1 year of satellite images. And part of the problem with the satellite is that our skies are not always clear. If they're cloudy, then we can't see, so we have to miss some images. But the work that Jeff Strock and Garcia did, that's for 3 years. So the prairie was not harvested over there. So I'm sure if you take the biomass away, it's going to have probably a little time to grow and come out. But on the other hand, if there's too much cover, it's going to also slow it down. So we have not looked at that issue, that if you harvest, if you don't. On the other hand, one thing that you want to keep in mind, if the vegetation stays on the land, and over the winter time, the cells of those plants, they are going to burst open and they give out soluble phosphorus. And that was one of the buffers problem that we are talking about. If you have buffers, you are pumping the phosphorus from the ground into that vegetation, the vegetation dies out and comes in contact with the water in the overland flow, it's going to give you a lot more phosphorus, soluble phosphorus going in the river. And this has been very well established by people from Canada, University of Manitoba, that having more year-round vegetation, when it dies, it's going to be giving out some soluble phosphorus.
Well, Steve, could you explain to him a little more the road problem with the high water and the DNR land to Satish?
Well, an observation that a number of people made, and it follows with what John is alluding to, is that we have these conservation lands, okay? They're not managed. There's no active growth, and if you have active growth, you'll have more water usage. But the observation is with those areas that have this, all of a sudden the water tables are increasing. Okay, over time. There's nothing there. You've got less water usage. I'm assuming you're going to have less runoff, or potentially more runoff, or you fill up the existing pore space to create a higher water table. And what's happened in the case over there is the water table has risen to the point of flooding the road because there's no outlet for the watershed, the small watershed. It doesn't outlet. But there are some spots just south of New Ulm is another example where the wetland, the conservation area was created. Once it's filled up, you get an inch of rain. Well, that inch of rain runs off if it's filled up.
Sure.
And I don't know if you could.
Well, I think, again, I got to see that landscape. I can't visualize what you're describing. But if the free water is sitting, if it's a free water like a pond or something, then you're going to have maximum evaporation. Okay? Irrespective whether you got a plant or not. But if it's saturated and near saturated and the plants are growing, and the plants are the ones that are the limiting factor in terms of evapotranspiration. Okay? But I think there are two reasons you can think about why is the water table building up. Is that because there's not enough evapotranspiration, or is it because we are getting a lot more rain? Okay? And maybe it's both. And the other thing that people have talked about is let's put store the water on the landscape. I have a little difficulty with this. I think if you guys are, work with the water spreads. So if you're going to pond it over here, it's going to affect the water table in your neighbor's plots over there. The water is going to move in the soil. And if it's close to the river, you are going to affect the bank slumping. So anything that you do in terms of upland storage, make sure do some experiment, just don't throw out ideas, oh, let's do this, okay? And I think this has been a problem that people in agencies, they say, we do this without doing some experiment and having some database, and they don't even collect, this data was collected by USGS. I wish they have been collecting on a control basis, a lot more data on nitrogen, a lot more rivers. So somebody in 20 years is going to come back and look at it. And that's the problem that I see in the agencies. But I don't know if I answered your question, but
I think
I'll have to look at
as good
the,
as you can. Yeah.
okay.
Greg had a question here. State your name. Greg Bartz. I actually have two questions. The first one just relates to what you just mentioned with the phosphorus runoff from the cells. There's more phosphorus runoff in those grass areas.
Yeah.
When you burn the area, are those nutrients, those phosphorus and stuff, is that running off right away with all that ash on top of the ground?
If the water is running off the land, it's going to carry it.
So you probably get more phosphorus
Yeah.
that way.
Change your phosphorus, it's going to be composition, you want to burn your, you're going to, when you burn it, soil, burn the grass.
Just hang on a second here.
This is coming from a little different background, but when you burn the grass, you're going to change the form of phosphorus from something that's more, to something that's less soluble than what's in the solid. Straight out of the plant is soluble phosphates. When you oxidize that plant, that phosphorus at a high heat, as in burn, you're going to change it to something that more resembles an orthophosphate. It will be less soluble. Still may be erodible, but it'll be less soluble.
Is it more likely to run off the land than it?
Yeah, because the rainfall, you now have reduced your ground cover, interception rates, and it will run downhill. But it's still changing. It's not going to be a simple question to answer because your form of phosphate will have changed. And where does it accumulate? Accumulate under the water where it will slowly go back to a soluble form of phosphorus, or does it accumulate along the landscape?
In a nutshell, the phosphorus that's associated with that burned area is more like the phosphorus that is bound to soil than would be versus the soluble phosphorus. So you'd have to effectively move the soil in order to, for practice purposes.
You had another question.
You had another question. I was wondering, you showed a slide that showed the nitrogen application with fertilizer and stuff like that. Have you done any studies measuring how much nitrogen comes off the crops, with the corn and soybeans, silage and stuff? That nitrogen is being removed from the soil. And also, you showed past years where there was more small grains, oats, that sort of thing, and now which probably doesn't remove as much nitrogen as modern day corn and soybeans. I was just wondering how that plays into it, since we're probably removing a lot more.
Well, I think keep in mind that I have done some work at Lambert, and no, I don't know if that was done in 1997 and 2000, but Giles and others have done it, Fabian and others. There are two sources of nitrogen in the soil. One is when we cultivate, we are mineralizing organic matter, and then we are also applying and fertilizer. So those two sources, we are picking it up with the plants. We're harvesting and taking some nitrogen. I can't give you the number because I don't remember, but Giles and others have. I think it would be 100 pounds per kilo per hectare, 100 pounds per acre, or 120, 25 or so. So there's always, our soils are very rich in organic matter, and there's a lot more mineralization going on. In some soils, I know Gary Malzer used to say, you don't have to add any nitrogen fertilizer and you can get a 200 bushel. Again, I don't know if you can do it every year, every place, but that's the problem. That it's very hard to know how much is the total nitrogen available at the start of the year. And most of you guys, are farmers, are applying it just to be sure, because early spring, soils are wet, you can't go in there and apply it in the springtime, that's why you apply in the fall. But again, I'm showing you that the variability in the soil, all the data that I show you from Illinois and Iowa, and Giles' data is exactly same data, that you are getting more nitrogen out because you have a lot more precip, and the differences between the treatments are not that big unless you are dumping a lot more nitrogen, and on a watershed basis, you are not dumping in a lot more watershed. So it's on an individual plot or field you might be doing it. So I can't tell you what the nitrogen balance might be on it at this time.
Okay, you have another question?
Pardon me?
Yields are a lot higher than.
Yeah, yields are higher, so we are picking up a lot more nitrogen too.
This is more nearly a comment than a question. Will Anthony, I'm a foreigner from Nickel County. Over the years, Satish, you've done a lot of really fine work on factors affecting both river and stream and now Gulf of Mexico hypoxic. I pay dues to soybeans, pay dues to corn, pay dues to Farm Bureau, and frankly, I'm disappointed that it's not been possible for these organizations to get more impact on the fine work that you have done affecting what we're doing in policy, including nitrogen management, including buffers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really, I think, from my point of view, a challenge in getting more money's worth out of the dues I'm paying.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I think it's not, you know, I have learned some lessons too working with you guys over the years, and I've taken a lot of arrows from the state agencies too, because it doesn't go with what they're trying to say. The difficulty is that you guys are not very well organized. I hate to say this, and the city folks, kids like, you know, my kids' age or something, they have a lot more say, and they go and yell, and mom and dad feeds them, and so they don't have to worry about making money. And you guys organize, you think, well, leave us alone, but I'm not sure you're just saying leave me alone is going to do you any good, okay? And I like to see you guys, it's tragedy that the state agencies, they say these things, but they're not putting the money to get the data. And I have to come to you guys. And you know that, you know, I have applied for the grant 5 times to the MDA. Every time I was rejected, and I'm doing the same work by getting money from you guys, and some of you guys are unhappy too. Foreign folks are unhappy with me because one project didn't turn out the way, you know, supposed to be. Research takes time. But you guys got to get organized and, you know, confront these people in a nice way. They are good people in the state agencies, but try to educate them. And I think the main problem you guys have, and I've told David Key over here many times, is a communication. You guys got to get these younger people who are going through my classes at the University of Minnesota, try to educate them what agriculture is about. You know, and anything we do on this planet, we're going to have an impact. You guys think about our river used to be on fire in Ohio, right? And now whose rivers are on muddy? China's, India's. The same pollution went over there. We don't manufacture cars over here, but they're manufacturing things for us. Some of that is their stupidity, because they want to bring their cost, you know, standard of living up. On the other hand, there's going to be some environmental impact. So we can't live, just say there shouldn't be any environmental impact.
Satish, you alluded to in your conclusions, and I think it's really important to try to tie this together. But you pointed out that, correct me if I'm wrong, that the flow is the driver for nitrogen
Flow
loads.
is the driver.
Okay.
Flow through the soil.
Flow goes through, but down the Mississippi, also it's the flow. The more water you have, the more nitrogen load you have, the more nitrogen.
Right.
The relationship in the Gulf of Mexico, there's a correlation of more nitrogen, more load, the greater the hypoxic area. The thing that's getting left out of the picture, it's also correlated to the flow.
It is correlated.
And the hypoxic area, if it gets measured,
Yeah.
it's directly proportional to the freshwater plume that comes out there. So is it the nitrogen load, the nitrogen amount, or is it the freshwater plume that's determining the size? Okay, that's one point though that I want to, okay, but more importantly from what you're saying is,
two, you just brought it up here, there's two major sources of nitrogen, the nitrogen fertilizer, and then there's the soils mineralization. The nitrogen fertilizer in these watersheds is fairly constant, yet the load is going up and down. So if the load is going up and down, that nitrogen has to come from somewhere, correct? And the only potential source that's likely to contribute a lot is the soils mineralization. That can fluctuate tremendously. More precipitation, the more moisture you have in the soil, the more moist it is, and this is, you can look at the areas with more rainfall, they get more mineralization contribution from the soil organic matter. So it would seem very logical that that would be the variable. Maybe it needs to be somehow documented.
I think it needs to be, I mean, this data that we analyze, I cannot tell you how much is coming from mineralization, how much is from fertilizer. And Matt Helmer from Iowa State has done some work. I think, I wouldn't say that all of this nitrogen is coming from mineralization. I think we need to document this, how much it is. And mineralization is very difficult to do because every year you have variability in temperature and cultivation and water content, and people have tried to do that. I think we got to get a better handle. So I think that's where we need to do the research. There are a lot of, there's things that we don't know, and I think we need to spend some time and money and have graduate students work on it. But I cannot say the nitrogen, excess nitrogen going to the Gulf of Mexico is from mineralization. Okay? I think there's some from nitrogen fertilizer and some from mineralization. I don't know what proportion it is.
Well, the point I'm making, though, it's one or the other. Basically, it's come down where it's, we maybe get a little bit more rainfall contribution, but it would be relatively minor. So we have to infer that if you've got more flow, it's coming. That's gotten left out of the picture there, and I think that's very fundamental to me because the nitrogen fertilizer contribution is the same year to year.
Yeah.
So
that's fertilizer.
It has to come from somewhere.
Yeah. And I think the other thing I want to say, okay, let's have the question. I am just talking too much.
Okay, here again.
Can I ask one?
You have to state your name and then you can ask.
Keith Lent. Dan Schmitz. You had mentioned, one of the remediation practices could be wetlands, and you alluded to both maybe what I would call landscape in situ wetlands, and then you also talked about the floodplains. Have you done any calculations on what the mass of that area would have to be, or what type of an impact that would have?
Oh, impact would be tremendous. I don't know what the area is. This came out of the work that I did early on in 1996 when we were looking at the sediment transport and why is Lake Pepper filling up so fast. Okay? I don't know how much area is available. If you go between St. Peter and Fort Snelling, just before the Minnesota Bridge over there, you see there are a lot of areas which is just kind of under natural vegetation. Can that be flooded? There's a National Wildlife Refuge by the airport. That's quite a bit of area. It used to be agricultural land. Can that be flooded? But then the question comes into, you got to bring the other people too. Is it going to affect some plants over there, or some birds, or some other amphibians or something? But I think that's a question we need to think about it. Putting the wetland on an upland position, it's okay, but the problem is you're holding the water over there, it's going to affect the water table next door. Okay, that's why I'm saying it, do in the floodplain, because that's going to be much easier to manage than doing it upland.
I think I'm hearing everything affects everything or something like that.
What buffers work? Work in the sense of what? Okay, buffers, I do not think it's going to work, but that's my personal opinion, okay? And the reason I'm saying is that buffers are, if you look at your land, it's so flat. Most of the land you can see miles and miles. So if you put a buffer, basically when you're digging the ditches, you're piling up the soil on the back, okay? And your back slope is towards in the middle of the field, okay? You can put a buffer over there, and that would be great for having pheasants, okay? And the buffers, when the vegetation dies, it's going to also give out soluble phosphorus, okay? So, and it's not going to work that much on the nitrogen because it's going to pick up the nitrogen only where the buffers are. Nitrogen is in the soil, it's moving through the soil. It doesn't move in the overland flow. And some of these people talk about not we're going to save a lot of nitrogen by putting a buffer. Nitrogen is moving through the soil. It's not moving in the overland flow. And buffers are only mostly good for overland flow. So that's my reason. But from pheasant's point of view, it's great. Okay? I think that's basically what he was trying to do. He just wanted to have more pheasants in the area, and that's pretty good.
We were hearing where, the hypoxic zone is probably caused by increased freshwater flow because of the increased rainfall. And of course, if we have less storms down there, we'd get less mixing, so we'd have a bigger zone too. So we kind of hope for some storms to mix that water up. I'm also wondering, we always see land being converted from farmland or other land to roads, to cities, to roofs and asphalt and stuff. And so I would think we get more water runoff just because we have less land that can absorb that water, or to grow crops or grow plants that would get rid of it.
Well, keep in mind, I think that's true, the asphalt is letting the water out. But unless you got a vegetation over there, you got to transpire the water up in the atmosphere or someplace. As long as water goes through the soil, it's going to flow up in the rivers. So I mean, people got to live, and we are going to have the asphalt, we're going to have the shingles. But I think most of this increase in trees, let me say this, it's just kind of ironic that farmers don't believe in that the climate is changing or whatever. Our city folks believe the climate is changing, but they don't think it's changing in the farm country. And it's pretty dumb, because we are getting a lot more precip. On the other hand, you guys are putting more and more tile line in there because you see your soil is wet and you want to go and harvest it. But you don't want to admit it's because we are getting more precip. Okay? I don't know what's causing it. And I'm not going to get in the argument whether we are causing it or something else, but our precip is increasing. Keep that thing in mind. It's possible it might go back to what it used to be. But at least city folks don't believe that you guys have wet climate. But when they see their houses going in the river, oh yeah, the car in Duluth going in a sinkhole, yeah, that was a, more precip.
All right. How are we doing with questions out there? Is everybody feeling pretty satisfied? I know we're getting up on 11:30. We have one here in front yet. I think we're gonna cut it off here pretty quick, but.
Yeah, Eckberg, Nicollet County. I was wondering if you have this research back in, say, the year 1600, what would be different? Back then you had prairie fires, just like we have in California now. And now you would wash all that sediment. It's the same thing, wouldn't you?
Oh yeah, if you go back and the research I did on the bank erosion, I went back and looked in the records. There are a lot of people came here and they start writing about this land and sell the books back out east. There was a gentleman, Fanshaw, he came in 1835. And he was going from Fort Snelling to Mankato and looks at the Blue Earth River and says loaded with mud of bluish color, and that was in September. Our rivers are not muddy in September because they had a big storm coming through it. And then Marianne Riggs, she was a missionary in Renville County. She was writing letters back home to her parents in Boston and her brother in Ohio, and she came from 1835. She came from Fort Snelling, go to St. Peter and go, have with a cart over there. And she said, I saw a lot of muddy, streams along the way. So these rivers have been muddy way before anybody came, okay? And these prairie used to get on fire because they burned it on their own sometimes to find their, Native Americans to find their friends and relatives. And there was lightning over there. So we don't know. I mean, this is a problem. People say these things, but nobody has gone and documented that. And I agree with you, but looking at this, you're going to have problems, when there is no vegetation when it's burning. So there were issues over there too. But again, you guys came first and I came a little bit later on. We also have an impact. Right? We, as a human being, we have an impact on planet.
I think that's good what you said earlier too, is just, everything has an impact on everything else.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of pick your poison to some degree. Steve, one last comment?
Research always raises more questions than answers. Okay, you've answered some good questions there. It's pretty clear from what you're saying that the nitrogen management part isn't going to have an impact on the loading. You talked about, but there's still this desire to reduce nitrates, okay? You mentioned the wetlands. One of the questions, though, that I think needs to be looked at is it desirable to do that? Right now, there's some other very significant issues being raised. Over the last decade or so, wherever we have increase in wetlands, we're now starting to talk about what they call hazardous algal blooms. We have it on one of our resolutions for our county here. And that's when you get the nitrogen and phosphorus out of balance. And basically when you drive the nitrate levels below a certain point, it's around a quarter to half part per million, we suddenly start triggering a whole bunch of other negative consequences. Where are we going? I'm concerned about, I alluded to it in the beginning, we have policies that go into play because of perceptions or assumptions. We've got to be careful not to get those policies ahead of getting the answers, because we could potentially create real serious issues to drive nitrate levels down that aren't necessarily desirable, and they can be very undesirable. There's already some indications of that's being quantified. What would be one focus of research yet that you think needs to be answered before we move on?
Oh, we got, I mean, I can, if you guys got money and if I was not retiring, I'd love to do a lot more. I mean, mineralization is a big challenge. Wetland, just see how effective it is. That's a big challenge. Somebody asked a question, how much impact would be, how much areas will, that's a good challenge. I think it's just, some of these questions should be answered by the agencies. You guys don't have to fund me. They should be funding, because they're just throwing out these ideas without any data, and then I get the money from you guys, and then it starts a conflict that you are getting funded by soybean guys, that's why your research is coming like that. Just these guys, they just want to make, if they agree, if they say that you guys have no impact, and these are what I'm saying is right, then somebody's going to ask, what the hell are you getting legacy money? Right? And so it's the whole thing is that they are going to tell you, I think some of the stuff they're doing is effective and good things. But they're going to come back in 20 years, and if you say you didn't produce anything, they'll show you a report. Yes, we did. And if you say they produced something, you don't need money next time, they say, no, you still are the problem. So I think it's a money problem. There are a whole series of questions, but I think they should be answering those, not you guys. I mean, you guys have been very generous in funding me, but I was going on other things, but I started this because I was interested in looking at the history and trying to see where it's coming from. But there are tons of stuff that we need to. Mineralization is one big part. How much is coming from the soil? Our soils are very rich in organic matter. All of these, going back down to Illinois and Ohio and so on. So, I'm sure there will be other questions. They are not going to believe this, and so you'll have some more questions. Okay? But thank you very much for having me over here.
Thank you very much for presenting, Satish, and if anybody's interested